Part 5, Chapter 5. They were not resigned, though, not by any means. Perhaps, logically, there was so little chance for a ship to get through that it would be the best to adopt an attitude of stoic resignation. But there was simply too much at stake. Every morning, Macklin wrote, on June 6th, I go to the top of the hill, and in spite of everything, I cannot help hoping to see a ship coming along to our relief. Even Hurley, who had been so positive, recorded that all hands scoured the skyline daily in the expectancy of a mast or plume of smoke. And though day after day no ship appeared, they attributed it to a dozen different reasons: the ice, the gales, the fog, arrangements for getting a proper ship, official delays, and all or any of these factors combined. There was almost never any mention of the most probable reason of all: the Caird had been lost. In an entry notable for its candor, Ordleys wrote, one cannot help but be a bit anxious about Sir Ernest. One wonders how he fared, where he is now, and how it is that he has not yet been able to relieve us. But the subject is practically taboo. Everyone keeps their own counsel and thinks different, and no one knows just what anyone else thinks about it, and it is quite obvious that no one really dares say what they really do think. But whatever each of them might think, there was nothing to do but to wait and hope. Each day one man took his turn as stoker, and it was his duty to tend the fire all day, keeping it going with penguin skins and a minimum of smoke. There was also the job of outside Peggy, which entailed bringing in ice for water and gathering the necessary supplies of frozen meat to be cooked. Both tasks were tedious, and there was a fair amount of trading in order to escape them. Half a penguin steak would usually buy the services of a substitute stoker for one day. There was also a good deal of bartering in the matter of rations, and several food pools were formed. Typical of these was the sugar pool, in which each man who belonged passed up one of his 3 lumps of sugar each day in order to partake of a feast when his turn came around every 6th or 7th day. Wild made no objection to this sort of thing. In fact, he permitted a wide range of flexibility in most matters. It served to avoid friction, and it gave the men something to occupy their minds. There was, on the whole, an astounding absence of serious antagonisms, considering the conditions under which they were attempting to exist. Possibly, it was because they were in a state of almost perpetual minor friction. Arguments rambled on the whole day through, and they served to let off a great deal of steam which might otherwise have built up. In addition, the party had been reduced to an almost classless society in which most of them felt free to speak their minds and did. A man who stepped on another man's head trying to find his way out at night was treated to the same abuse as any other, regardless of what his station might once have been. This matter of going outside at night to relieve themselves was possibly the most disagreeable aspect of their existence. A man had to pick his way amongst the sleepers by the light of only a single blubber lamp, kept burning specifically for this purpose. It was almost physically impossible to avoid stepping on somebody somewhere. Then came the crawl through the hut entrance and out into the weather, which often approached blizzard conditions. Frequently, a man could scarcely keep his feet outside. Pieces of rock and bits of ice flew unseen through the blackness. Rather than face such a prospect, the men came to practice bladder control to the limits of bodily endurance. After a time, however, Wild succumbed to mounting pressure, and a 2-gallon gasoline can was made into a urinal for use at night. The rule was that the man who raised its level to within 2 inches of the top had to carry the can outside and empty it. If a man felt the need and the weather outside was bad, he would lie awake waiting for somebody else to go so that he might judge from the level of the can's contents. If it sounded ominously close to the top, he would try to hold out until morning, but it was not always possible to do so, and he might be forced to get up. More than once, a man would fill the can as silently as possible, then steal back into his sleeping bag. The next man to get up would find to his fury that the can was full and had to be emptied before it could be used. The unfortunate victim, however, could expect very little sympathy. Most of the men looked on this as a kind of practical joke, and anyone who really lost his temper about it was so roundly ridiculed by the others that he soon gave it up. But there was definite fluctuations in morale in accordance with the weather and whether the pack was in or out. When the sun did shine, the islands became a place of rugged beauty, with the sunlight shimmering off the glaciers, producing indescribably vivid colors that were constantly changing. For all the party, it was difficult to be unhappy on days like this, but most of the time, the island was far from beautiful. Though the gales were fewer, there were long stretches of wet, gloomy weather, resulting in the kind of outlook Greenstreet recorded one evening. Everyone spent the day rotting in their bags with blubber and tobacco smoke, so passes another goddamn rotten day. Throughout May, the more pessimistic members of the party, championed by Ordleys, had predicted that one day the penguins would migrate and never be seen again until the end of the winter. Ordleys felt so strongly, in fact, that he made a number of bets on the matter. Then one day, early in June, he lost 3, all at the same time. He had wagered that there would not be a single penguin on that day, that no more than 10 would appear on any one day after June 1st, and that no more than 30 would be secured during the entire month. On that particular day, they killed 115. Food was thus not a cause for immediate concern, but there were other matters that needed attention, notably Blackborough's foot. Early in June, McElroy was satisfied that the separation between the dead and the living tissue was complete, and it would be dangerous to postpone the operation any longer. A rescue in time to get Blackborough to a hospital where the amputation might be done properly was now obviously out of the question. The operation would have to take place on the next warm day. June 15th dawned mild and misty. McElroy, after consulting with Wild and Macklin, decided to proceed. Blackborough had long before resigned himself to the operation. What few surgical supplies they had were made ready, and as soon as breakfast was over, the hush pot was filled with ice, which was melted into water and brought to a boil to sterilize the instruments. A number of packing cases were placed side by side close to the stove and covered with blankets to serve as an operating table. When everything was ready, the men were herded outside to wait until the operation was over. The 2 other invalids, Hudson and Greenstreet, remained in the hut. Hudson lay at the far end, but Greenstreet's berth across the seats of the docker was directly over the operating scene. Wild and Howe both stayed inside to assist, and Hurley remained to stoke the fire. As soon as the man had left, he began to pile penguin skins onto the blaze. As the temperature started to rise, Blackborough was lifted onto the operating table. Every available blubber lamp was lighted, and the dingy interior of the hut grew fairly light in the little circle around the stove. When it was warm enough, McElroy and Macklin stripped to their undershirts, the cleanest garments they had. The anesthetic was to be chloroform, not a very good anesthetic, especially close to an open fire, but it was all they had, and there were only 6 ounces of that. Macklin, who was to administer it, waited for the hut to get warm enough so that the chloroform would vaporize. As Hurley fed skins into the stove, the temperature crept upward. Within 20 minutes, it had reached a sweltering 80 degrees, and Macklin uncorked the bottle of chloroform and poured a small amount onto a piece of surgical gauze. Then he patted Blackborough's shoulder reassuringly and held the gauze across his face. He instructed Blackborough to close his eyes and breathe deeply, and Blackborough obediently did as he was told. Within 5 minutes, he was unconscious, and Macklin nodded to McElroy that he could begin. Blackborough's foot was propped up and extended over the edge of the packing cases. A large empty tin can was placed underneath. When the bandage was removed, the flesh of Blackborough's toes looked almost mummified, black and brittle. Wild removed a scalpel from the hushpot sterilizer and handed it to McElroy. At the far end of the hut, Hudson turned his face away so that he wouldn't have to watch. Greenstreet, however, peered down from his perch, thoroughly absorbed in what was going on beneath him. McElroy cut across the end of Blackborough's foot, then peeled the skin back. Macklin glanced at Wild and saw that he never flinched. A hard case, Macklin thought to himself. McElroy then asked for a pair of forceps, and Wild removed them from the boiling water. To Greenstreet, they looked like a pair of tin snips. Carefully, McElroy reached well under well up under the flap of skin to where the toes joined to the foot. Then one at a time, he cut them off. Each dropped with a metallic clatter into the empty tin can below. Next, McElroy meticulously scraped away the dead, blackened flesh, and when the wound was clean, he carefully stitched it up. Finally, it was done. Blackborough's foot had been neatly trimmed off just at the ball joint. Altogether, it had taken 55 minutes. Before long, Blackborough began to moan, and in a little while he opened his eyes. He was groggy for a time, but then he smiled up at the two doctors. "I'd like a cigarette," he said. So McElroy tore a page out of the Encyclopedia Britannica, rubbed up some plugged tobacco, and rolled a cigarette for his patient. The tension in the hut eased, and Wild, seeing the hush pot full of water, suggested that they use it to wash. McElroy and Macklin were delighted with the idea. A tiny scrap of soap was found, and they removed their undershirts and washed themselves as best they could down to their waists. Still, a small amount of hot water remained, so they borrowed 3 lumps of sugar from the next day's ration and brewed themselves some hot sugar water. The rest of the men, meanwhile, had sought shelter in the cave which had been dug in the face of the glacier. They had spent the time cutting one another's hair.